My name is Yehuda Kaplan, and I'm one of the curators at the Bible Lands Museum, Jerusalem. Together with me, you're going to go around here in the main exhibits of the museum and follow the ancient civilizations that emerged here in the cradle of civilizations, the ancient Near East, what we call here the lands of the Bible. Those civilizations encompass what we call the world of the Bible, the reality behind the biblical stories. Join me now and let's follow those most fascinating artifacts which tells us a lot about those ancient people and stories. I'm standing now in front of the map of the lands of the Bible here at the Bible Lands Museum. This map can show us the main biblical civilizations, people, nations, and lands that we read about in the Bible. For example, the two main centers of civilizations are seen here. On one side, we can see between the Euphrates and the Tigris, the land that the Greeks called Mesopotamia, meaning the land between the rivers. These two big rivers actually were the core or the beginning or the cradle of civilizations in this region. We are going to meet the civilizations that arose here some more than 5,000 years ago in southern Mesopotamia, what today is modern Iraq, the Sumerians. We're going to follow their great innovations and actually their legacy that some of it remained with us until today. Following the Sumerians, we have the Akkadians and later on two very important civilizations that affected the fate of Judah and Israel in biblical times. In the southern part of Mesopotamia, Babylon with Babel, and in the northern part we have Assyria. We're going to meet the Assyrians. On the other side of the world, right here, we can see along the Nile River the other force that actually played a big role in the history of biblical times. And I'm talking, of course, about Egypt, ancient Egypt, not to forget also that south of Egypt, in what today is Sudan and northern Ethiopia, we have another very important and striving civilization, which is Nubia, biblical Kush. In between those two centers of civilizations, we have the Levant, this narrow bridge land which connected continents, civilizations, people, and forces in ancient time. In the southern Levant, of course, Israel and Judah, the two kingdoms that the Bible focuses on, but we have also their neighbors that we're going to meet here in our visit at the museum. We're going to meet in what today mainly is the coastal area of Lebanon and Syria, the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians which actually follow the Canaanites, the main civilization that thrived here in the second millennium BCE. Together with them, the Arameans here in what today is modern Syria, and also the people in Transjordan, Ammon, Moab, and Edom, here eastern of Israel. Of course, we have other areas and important civilizations, maybe a bit before the biblical times, but they are mentioned in the Bible. We have here in modern Turkey of today, the land of the Hittites, a very important superpower that dominated northern Syria in the second half of the second millennium BCE. Of course, in the later part of the biblical time, on the other side of the world again, we have a very important civilizations that actually dominated not only the Fertile Crescent, but also the entire ancient world. And I'm talking, of course, about ancient Persia, who actually controlled the vast areas that were part of the Neo-Assyrian and the Neo-Babylonian empires. Follow me now, and we're going to visit all those people and civilizations as they are depicted here in the artifacts of the Bible Lands Museum. After several thousands of years that humans settled down, domesticated plants and animals, and started what we call the agricultural revolution, we see that the villages steadily grew and became the earliest cities of the ancient Near East. In front of me, you can see several objects that represent this process and phenomena. These are all seals. The one here on the left below is a normal, what we call a normal seal, stamping seal, but the other three have a cylindrical shape. And these are very typical objects to the Sumerian and later Mesopotamian culture in the early periods. Some of the seals here, or actually all of them, are representing buildings. These look like monumental buildings, probably temples. The temples became the most important institution in the early cities. These were not only the places that people came to bring offering and to contact with their gods, of course, with the priests serving there, but also these were very important economical institutions. Some of them were actually the ancient banks. They were very much involved in business, loaning, and other economical activities that made them very, very wealthy and important in the structure of the earliest cities. Together with the buildings, we can see also animals, which probably also are related to the economical activity that took place in those important institutions. Let me take you now and show you another innovation that took place during this important period. Southern Mesopotamia is very poor in raw materials. Actually, in ancient times, the inhabitants had a lot of water coming from the main rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. They had some date palms, but a lot of mud and reeds. This probably explains why one of the greatest innovations in this area, the beginning of documenting and writing, started with the history of mud. In front of us, we can see a group of clay tablets, all made, of course, of mud, basically, that represent the script that developed in southern Mesopotamia in the last years of the 5th millennium BCE. The Sumerian, the earliest civilizations that evolved in southern Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago, is a non-Semitic civilization. The Sumerian language is not related to any of the known families of languages that we know today. Therefore, there is still an enigma if we're talking about an autochthonic civilization or people that were living in southern Mesopotamia, or whether they immigrated from another part of the world. Anyway, they are responsible for the earliest writing system that evolved in southern Mesopotamia that we call the cuneiform script. Pay attention to tablet number 4. Looking carefully in it, we can see that the signs, the symbols, are looking more like drawings. Something very similar that we see also in ancient Egypt with the hieroglyphics. This is the system that what we call the pre-cuneiform writing system, which probably the drawings represent all kinds of items that were part of the economic activity that took place in the early Sumerian city-states. For example, lists of products, maybe loans, or other documentation of this activity. Looking carefully, we can see a horned animal, we can see 2 fishes, and they are all drawn in rectangulars with other symbols that might represent numbers of those commodities. The idea of documentation is actually part of the economic activity in southern Mesopotamia. As the economic activity grew steadily, there was a need to document it. If somebody, for example, took a loan of grain or fish or dates, he had to return it after several years or months. It had to be documented. You could not actually remember it in the oral system. Therefore, there was a need to document it. Since they don't have the papyrus or other means, somebody in a very genuine way decided to take a piece of clay and to draw this information on the clay tablets. But very soon, talking about several hundred years, we see that the drawing system was evolved to become a much more faster and convenient way to write by what we call the cuneiform signs. And these are wedge-shaped symbols that actually imitated the original drawings. It is much convenient, efficient, and faster to pinpoint on the clay tablet with a stylus made of reed, which was also very common in this area, than to draw a drawing. Therefore, we see that those drawings became what we call in modern times the cuneiform, the wedge-shaped symbols and sign of the Mesopotamian ancient writing system. Let's follow and see other innovations of the Sumerian civilization. As the Sumerian cuneiform writing system developed, we can see that this writing system was used not only for economic activity and transactions, but also to write more sophisticated pieces. For example, we know a lot about the religion and the cult practices of the Sumerians and other Mesopotamian ancient civilizations from these documentations on the clay tablets. Another source for our knowledge about beliefs, gods, mythologies come also from artistic depictions, for example, on those cylinder seals that we can see here. Pay attention here to number 2, a very impressive artifact made of a very precious blue rock called lapis lazuli. The lapis lazuli is found in our region only in Afghanistan, and since it is found in all the ancient Near Eastern countries and civilizations, we assume that trafficking this material was very sophisticated already in early times. The lapis lazuli cylinder seal depicts a scene, a very common scene that we see in Mesopotamian art, which shows us on the right probably the seal owner, in this case dignitary, a lady, and she is presented in front of one of the main gods of early Mesopotamia. Looking at this scene, we can see that both gods and humans are looking alike. What is the way, therefore, to make the difference between the two? Pay attention that the deities are wearing a horn crown. The horns belong to the most significant animal in those agricultural civilizations, and I'm talking about the bull. The bull represents the power, the fertility, and all the activities that are related to the well-being of humans. Therefore, in order to represent the superhuman power of the gods, they wear those horn crowns that make the difference between them and ordinary humans. Pay attention to this scene, which is actually coming from cylinder seal number 4 right here. In this case, we see 3 deities, again, looking on their horn crowns. The one in the middle, the most important of course, is coming out from 2 mountains, and you can see the sun rays that are coming out of his shoulders. This is a human representation of the sun god. So in Sumerian, the name of this god is Utu, but in Akkadian, a Semitic language, his name is Shamash. Shamash, very similar to the word Shemesh in Hebrew, which means sun. Therefore, we see here the sun god coming out from the mountains. Remember, the ancient Mesopotamians, and also today, people living in Iraq, when they wake up early in the morning and they look to the east, they see the Iranian plateau from which the sun is shining. The two gentlemen on both sides of Shamash, the sun god, are actually his servants. In this case, they are also gods, minor gods, and what they're doing here, they are opening the gates of his palace or his temple, allowing him to go for his daily journey in the sky. This image is actually explaining to us the way the ancient Mesopotamians and the other civilizations of the ancient world, how they actually explained phenomena, natural phenomena and other phenomena that they saw around them. The way they explained them is in the same way that they were living. For example, people are living in their families. They have children, they have parents. Therefore, also the world of the God is represented as a family, the family of gods. We have the senior gods, the parents, and also the minor ones. In the mythologies that we know from ancient Mesopotamia, sometimes we see that those gods can fight among themselves. They can also kill or even hate others, gods and also humans. Therefore, the relations between gods and humans was something very important. Follow me now and let's see another very important element in the ancient Sumerian city-states. One of the most important elements in the Mesopotamian, in this case the Sumerian city-state, was the sacred tower, known as the ziggurat or ziggurat, which means rising tower in this case. The ziggurat was a sacred temple that, together with the main temple in the city-state, represented the connection or function as the connection, the bond between earth and heaven, between humans and gods. In the ancient Mesopotamian theology, gods and humans were related. The relationship between humans and gods was essential in the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. The temples, and in this case also the ziggurats, symbolized the dependence of humans on their gods. The people were praying, the priests were making offerings and sacrifices to the gods so that they won't harm and help the people to survive, to have food, water, children, of course, and all the things needed to thrive. It seems that the ziggurat, which was built entirely, almost entirely, from mud bricks, and looks like a Mesoamerican pyramid, but it's much earlier than the Mesoamerican civilization. It was all made of mud bricks, no spaces inside, and you see that each platform is actually more elevated than the other one. On the top, it seems that there was a small shrine which allowed the deity to come down from heavens and at a certain level meet the humans. The priests that were allowed to enter into the sacred person were actually stepping up on the step structure that you can see in front of you, and at a certain moment there was a level that both gods and humans met. Of course, when we talk about a tower and mud bricks, it reminds us of the very famous story in the book of Genesis about the Tower of Babel. The biblical story about the Tower of Babel is inspired from what we know from the Mesopotamian ancient ziggurat. And of course, this is a polemic story which wants to fight against the idea that there might be a certain level where humans and gods can meet. Of course, in the biblical monotheistic notion, God is above any kind of human representation or thought, is above time and space, and therefore no way there could be a connection This explains why in the biblical story, God was so angry about the people in the valley of Shinar, maybe ancient Sumer, and therefore he punished them by spreading them all around and making them speak in different languages. Follow me now and let's meet the important civilization in the other part of the world. Let's go now. The advantage in the Bible Lands Museum, Jerusalem, is that in a few steps you can jump from one side of the ancient world to the other. And now we are standing in front of an impressive model of the famous site of the pyramids at Giza. The pyramids were built in the mid-3rd millennium BCE, about 4,500 years ago, and the big pyramid of Khufu, here at the right side, was one of the famous 7 wonders of the ancient world, the only one which survived until today. The pyramids in the Old Kingdom of Egypt actually represent 3 basic things that follow the entire ancient Egyptian civilization. We're talking about the idea of the importance of the sun and the sun god, the importance of the king, of the Egyptian king, who was regarded when he was alive as the son of the sun god, and when he died, he merged with his father, the sun god himself. Therefore, he went to a heavenly journey to join with his father, which brings us to the third element or concept in the ancient Egyptian thought, which was the idea that when you die, you are actually reborn in the realm of the dead. Actually, it seems that every ancient Egyptian wanted, when he died, to gain his eternal life in the world of the dead, and therefore he made a lot of things in order to earn it when he was alive, but especially his family members would do it after he died. In each of the pyramids, one king was buried. You can see that around the pyramid there are rectangular buildings. These were also tombs where the family members and the high officials of the king were buried together with him, so that they would serve him also in the afterlife. Guarding the entire burial place, the necropolis at Giza, we can see the Sphinx. The famous Sphinx, an legendary hybrid animal with a human face and a body of a lion, is actually keeping the entire site from any harm and evil forces that might interfere with the quiet of the spirits of the dead. Pay attention also to this channel that was coming from the Nile River, the Nile which was giving the life to the ancient Egyptians and was, as the French said, the gift of Egypt, or Egypt was the gift of the Nile. This artificial channel, which was dug from the Nile, was used in order to bring the dead mummified bodies of the Egyptian kings of the Old Kingdom to the burial site. And here in the temples, the ceremonies were made in order to prepare the body of the king and place it in his eternal resting place inside the pyramid. I want you to see with me now one element that was found in one of those burial tombs of the high officials, which will explain to us a bit more about the burial practices and funerary ceremonies of the ancient Egyptians. I'm standing now in front of a very interesting piece. This is actually what we call a false door or a false gateway. Originally, it was in one of the tombs of the high officials in the period of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, something like 4,500 years ago. You can see that it is all full with the typical writing system of ancient Egypt, what we call the hieroglyphs. These are all signs and symbols carved in the limestone, and most of them are actually formulas which will help the deceased to survive in the afterlife. The hieroglyphs indicate that the man that was buried in this tomb was a priest. He was a priest of the god Ptah. His name was Impi. It's very interesting to indicate the hieroglyphs which mean the word or the idea of priest. You can see it right here. There's a man bending on his knees and rising his hands up. He's praying, and above him you can see here that there is a kind of a vessel, a jar, with holy liquid, maybe water, maybe oil, and it all shows the activity of the priest. The word for priest in ancient Egyptian is also pure, and of course you can understand the connection between the two. What is the false door doing inside the tomb? According to the Egyptian belief, the human, the man or woman, they have three elements in their existence. One of them can be compared to a kind of a wandering soul which can actually wander from the realm of the dead and enter into the realm of the living. The false door also enabled the family members of the deceased, in this case the priest Impi, to come every year to the tomb and together with the priest recite the formulas that will enable the dead man to survive in the afterlife. Pay attention, for example, the repeating symbol right here in this line. This is the sign for 1000, and all the symbols beneath it represent all kinds of commodities, like beer to drink, like bread, like ducks, for example. So it means that a lot of those commodities will be available for the deceased, so he can actually be alive and exist in the realm of the dead. Here in the middle we can see Impi himself sitting and maybe working in his computer in his office, but actually it's not. He is actually sitting in front of an offering table full with loaves of bread, again, so he can eat and survive in the afterlife. Let's see more about the ancient Egyptian. Follow me, please. I'm standing now between two original wooden models that stood near a coffin inside a tomb of noble people in ancient Egypt in the period that we call the Middle Kingdom, something like 3,500 years ago. Here we can see a beer brewer. He's actually preparing the most popular drink of the ancient world that was drank not only by humans but also by the gods. It was given as an offering to the temple. The man here is preparing the alcoholic drink, and later on is going to put it inside those sealed jars that will eventually become this popular drink. Right here we see another scene, a slaughterhouse. The poor cow here is being slaughtered, and from its body all kinds of food will be made. What are those models doing inside the tomb? They are part of the ancient Egyptian belief about the survival of the deceased in the afterlife. When we talk about death in ancient Egypt, it's not just the survival of a soul, but it's the physical survival of the human body. Therefore, everything, all his necessities that he had in his life should be also be part of his life in the afterlife. Therefore, he had to drink, he had to eat, and also to travel. So we can see here also in the museum collection a very impressive riverboat with the entire team, the entire crew that is actually sailing on the Nile, which was also part of the realm of the dead in the thought of the ancient Egyptians. Let's meet now one of the famous pharaohs that we know also from the biblical stories in our Bible. In front of us, we see now a very impressive statue made of solid black rock, representing one of the most known pharaohs in Egypt. I'm talking about Ramses II, a ruler from the 19th dynasty who ruled in Egypt for around 70 years in the 13th century BCE. We know that we are talking about the headless Ramses here because we have his royal names here inside those oval-shaped cartouches, which usually bear the royal names of the Egyptian kings already from early times. Two other very important symbols that we can see here that actually are the king's titles are this rounded shape and the duck, which is actually the combination of the title, the son of the sun god. Okay, every ruler of Egypt was regarded as the son of the sun god. These two symbols, the reed and the bee or wasp, are actually the historical symbol of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Every dominant ruler in Egypt actually controlled both of them. It is interesting that the Hebrew name for Egypt, Mitzrayim, bears the dual ending, like Yadayim, hands, or Oznaim, ears, maybe because we are actually talking about both Egypt, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Ramses II was one of the most important Egyptian monarchs. During his time, ancient Egypt rose to its peak, and we know that controlled the land of Canaan. It is also important to say that Ramses II's son, Merem-Ptah, wrote a very famous inscription today in the National Museum of Cairo, what is known as the Israel stele. On a black stone, at the end of the inscription, we read the name Israel for the first time in extra-biblical document. And that might also give us some kind of a chronological anchor to the idea of the emergence of ancient Israel in the land of Canaan. Let's go and learn more about the ancient Egyptian thoughts and beliefs. Here we see a piece of a decoration from a tomb of a dignitary from the New Kingdom, the time of Ramses II that we just saw before. Although the piece is broken, we can see here two scenes. The lower one, with the Egyptian hieroglyphs, show us a warehouse full of goodies. Again, this warehouse and all the commodities inside of it are for the deceased. The upper scene is quite broken, and it's a bit difficult to understand exactly what we see here, together with the offering table here and some kind of a very, very frightening creature opening its mouth with the two human legs right here. To help us to understand what we actually see here, let's move and see the reconstruction right here, which show us the full scene. Here again, the offering table, the two human legs are actually part of an Egyptian god, as can be seen from its head, which has the head of a bird, the ibis bird. What we actually see here is the most important scene in the journey of the deceased from the realm of the living, from the world, to the realm of the dead. After a very, very dangerous journey, he would stand in front of the tribunal of the gods. And the gods headed by the god of the king of the realm of the tribunal, headed by the king of the realm of the dead, the god Osiris, here in the form of a mummified dead king. This tribunal is going to decide whether our deceased is going to gain his eternal life in the realm of the dead. The main scene here is depicted right over here, when we can see the jackal-headed god Anubis actually weighing the heart of the deceased in front of the image of the goddess of justice, the cosmic order, the goddess Ma'at, here with her attribute, a feather. According to the Egyptian theology and belief, a heart that was heavy with very, very bad deeds. Therefore, it's going to be heavier than the image of the goddess of justice. But a good man, a man that didn't do any harm, his heart is going to be empty from the bad deeds, and therefore is going to be lighter even than the feather of Ma'at. So we can imagine that every man in ancient Egypt, no matter if we're talking about a pharaoh or a common man, would hope that his heart is going to be lighter in the sentence of the dead, in the judgment of the dead done by the gods. If the man's heart was heavy because of the bad deeds, it means that his heart is going to be swallowed, eaten by this terrifying creature, a combination of a crocodile, a lion, and a hippo, the most terrifying creatures in the Nile Valley. It's interesting that this concept can be seen also in the biblical story of the Exodus. In the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew version of the book of Exodus, we read that God made Pharaoh's heart heavier. In the other languages, it is said that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, we read, make the heart heavier. And it is interesting to show that the immorality, or the wickedness of the Egyptian Pharaoh is actually depicted in the same way as the ancient Egyptian believed. So from the heavy heart and the judgment of the dead of Egypt, let's do the Exodus and meet other neighbors of ancient Israel in the ancient Near East. We're going to meet now the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the area of the Levant, especially during the 2nd millennium BCE. We learn about the Canaanites, the people that lived in ancient Canaan, which was part of the southern Levant and what today is also Syria and Lebanon, especially from the stories of the conquest of the land of Canaan. Who were those Canaanites? We know that they were Semitic people because of their language. Later on, we're going to meet their scriptures. But here you can see a group of figurines that come mainly from the areas of northern Syria, which was part of the Canaanite realm. And we see that those figurines depict maybe common people, but maybe also gods. One of the most characteristic features of the ancient Canaanites, according to the biblical view, is of course their cult and belief. Their practices, which are regarded as abomination in the view of the biblical scribes, can be seen here in this group of figurines, some of them made of metal and some of them made of clay. Pay attention to this impressive figurine here at the corner, made of clay, showing the image of a woman holding her breast, a very common picture that we see in many artistic representations all around the Middle East, probably related to the idea of the woman as representing the idea of fertility and the goddess of fertility. In this case, we're talking about a stand of a lamp, an oil lamp, which is a bit broken at the top, which probably served in a temple or a shrine and is related maybe to some kind of ritual that had to do with fertility. In the Bible, we see a lot of reference to this kind of practices and ceremonies that are related to what the Canaanites were doing in their temples in Canaan. I want to invite you now to see one of the most famous deities that is related to fertility that we learn about it in the biblical stories. Follow me now. This impressive bronze statue of a very, very strong young man holding his weapon in his right hand, preparing to smite his enemies, is one of the most beautiful examples that we have here in the museum collection of the famous god, Canaanite god, Baal, actually the Lord. This is his title. We know that his personal name was Hadad, also a name that we find in the Bible. It is made of bronze, and probably the eyes were embedded with precious stones. Maybe the original statue was also covered with silver or gilded. We know that we are talking about a deity here, a Canaanite deity, because of the PUEBLOS crown that it wears, and we can see that above the forehead, on the bottom of the crown, we can see also horns. So this is the famous god that the prophets, the biblical prophets and the biblical stories are talking about, one of the big enemies of the God of Israel, or the belief in the God of Israel. Baal was the head of the is regarded also as one of the most important gods in the Canaanite pantheon. His father El, the head of the pantheon, is also mentioned in the biblical writings. Baal was responsible for the storms and the rains, and therefore he was regarded as a fertility god. That explains why he was so popular, and the belief in Baal was so popular. In many of the biblical writings, we see that there is a kind of syncretism between the Canaanite god Baal and the God of Israel. Many of the titles of the God of Israel are found in the Canaanite writings and the Canaanite mythologies. For example, the famous battle between Baal and the sea monsters, as can be seen also in the famous Psalms and also the book of Isaiah, talking about the legendary ancient struggle between the God of Israel and the sea and its monsters. So again, we see how the Canaanite heritage also affected the biblical writings. Let's see now another innovation that emerged within the Canaanite world, an invention that actually affects our lives here today until now. One of the most important innovations that evolved within the Canaanite world is the invention of the alphabet. Both in Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, there were very sophisticated writing systems that we already met. The hieroglyphs in Egypt and the cuneiform system in ancient Mesopotamia. Those two systems were very complicated, included a lot of symbols and signs to remember. Therefore, the knowledge of reading and writing was in the hands of very few people, the professional scribes, both in Egypt and Mesopotamia. It's interesting that 1,000 years after we have already those two sophisticated systems in Egypt and Mesopotamia, in the Canaanite world emerged a completely different way of writing. And I'm talking about the invention of the alphabet. The alphabet was influenced probably by the Egyptian hieroglyphs. We can see it, for example, in the symbol of the water, which is known from hieroglyphs, which symbolizes the letter M, or Mem in ancient Hebrew and probably Canaanite. The word of the letter Mem is very much similar to the word Maim, which means water. Look, for example, to this symbol. It shows us schematic drawing of a house, okay? A rectangular building with an entrance. This is the letter Bet, which is very much similar to the word Bait, house. So how does the alphabet works actually? In both the Mesopotamian and Egyptian writing systems, at the beginning, each drawing symbolized or represented an idea or a word, or maybe a combination of a consonant and a vowel, part of a word. But in the alphabetic Canaanite system, the idea was to choose a word, a specific word, which opens with a specific sound And now the drawing of the word will actually represent the sound and not the idea. Let me show it to you with the famous Aleph or Alpha or A as we know it today. Look how it actually evolved from the Canaanite to the Phoenician, the Paleo-Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, and later on to the modern transliterations. So let's go and meet now the evolution of the letter Aleph. The first evidence that we have of alphabetic writings come from the peninsula of Sinai, south of the land of Israel, today in modern Egypt. And there, in turquoise mines that were actually in the hands of the Egyptian pharaohs of the New Kingdom, we know that also Semitic Canaanite workers were working there, both as mine excavators, but also as convoy leaders and so on, that were bringing the supplies and the commodities to and from the mines of this site, which is known as Sarabit el-Khadem. In those mines, there was a shrine for the famous Egyptian goddess of the mines, the goddess also of love and music, which we know as Khatho. So in the shrine of Khatho, the Egyptians that were working and handling the mine were worshipping the goddess who was responsible for their safety and their success in excavating the mines. Together with them, the Canaanites that were working there too wanted also to bring offerings and to pray to the goddess that they saw as their benefactor, but they didn't have their own scribe. What we see in Sarabit el-Khadem, in the inscriptions there, that they were actually imitating some of the known hieroglyphs in order to represent the sounds that actually combine the alphabetic writings. Let's look now at the evolution, okay, of the Aleph. Here we see the Proto-Canaanite form of writing the letter Aleph. Okay, the drawing of a bull's head is not to express the idea of the word bull, the animal bull, but only to pick the consonant that will represent the sound A. And in ancient Hebrew and also ancient Canaanite, the word bull was aluf. Okay, therefore you can see the similarity between the aluf, the aleph, and also the alpha that we know later on in the Greek alphabet. So as we saw also in the cuneiform script, the drawing was replaced very quickly with a more schematic and simple symbol. And here we can see the linearic Proto-Canaanite Aleph, then evolved in the late second millennium in the Phoenician script to the way the Phoenician wrote the Aleph, and from it you can see how it actually continues to the Paleo-Hebrew, the ancient Hebrew that was used in the first temple period, okay, in the biblical times, later on to the Aramaic, and then to the Greek. From it, it evolved, and we can see that, for example, the modern Aleph that we use today was actually an evolution coming from the Aramaic branch, especially from the early second temple period onwards. We can see that we have a southern branch that was developed in the Arabian Peninsula, what today is Saudi Arabia, Yemen, ancient kingdom of Sheba, and also even in Africa, in the Ethiopian Gez script. We find the Aleph, the Alpha in Europe, of course, because the Phoenicians transformed it or transmitted it to the Aegean world, and we can see how it evolved in the area of both Greek and Italy until it got to all the modern scripts that many people use until today. So it all comes from the aluf, from the bull, the Proto-Canaanite bull. So again, we see how the Canaanite heritage actually lives among us until today. Let's now go and meet the descendants of the Canaanites, which are the Phoenicians, the northern neighbors of Israel and Judah in the first temple period. We learned it already from the famous story of the building of the Solomonic temple in Jerusalem by King Solomon, of course. In Lebanon and the coastal area of Syria, northern Syria, we have plenitude of cedar wood, and because of the cedar forest there, and therefore the Phoenicians were known by their building ability. It is no surprise then to find that Solomon invites the builders of Hiram, king of Tyre, his neighbor from the north, to help him to build the temple in Jerusalem. The cedar wood also enabled the Phoenicians. By the way, the Phoenicians is the Greek name that was given to the inhabitants of the Canaanite areas that were continued to have this Canaanite culture also in the first millennium BCE, and probably the name Phoenicians, derives from one of the most famous productions that came from this world, and I'm talking about the purple and the blue dyes that were used or produced from specific snails that are growing in the Mediterranean until today, and they were used to dye very, very high-class garments made of wool especially. So the word, Greek word phoenix is related to the purple color. So together with the cedar wood, or the cedar wood was also used to make sailing boats in the Mediterranean Sea. Therefore, the Phoenicians were also known as the great sailors and the great merchants of the ancient world. They not only sailed along the coast of the Mediterranean, arriving to many places, they also established new colonies along the coast, arriving even to North Africa, the famous Carthage, and also even to Spain. Another thing that we already mentioned about the Canaanite world, and especially the Phoenicians, is the Phoenician script, which evolved from the Proto-Canaanite script. And it is important for us to understand also the biblical writings, because we know that in the first temple period, the Paleo-Hebrew actually was a script that evolved from the Phoenician script, which a very nice example can be seen here on the shoulder of this jar. The inscription is talking about a funeral practice of burying the bones of the deceased inside the jar. And it's also interesting because it is mentioning two names. The name Itubal, which means the man of Baal, and this is a name that we find in the Bible. The father of Jezebel, the princess that married Ahab, the king of Israel, is known as Etbaal, and he was the king of Sidon. So we find already from the time of Solomon, and especially in the time of the kings of the house of Omri in the northern kingdom, in the kingdom of Israel in the 9th century, very, very close relationship, diplomatic and also economic relations between Israel and the Phoenician city-states. And one of the most known ones is the diplomatic marriage of Ahab, the son of Omri, king of Israel, to Jezebel, who was a Phoenician princess coming from Sidon. Now, this economic and diplomatic relationship also brought what the biblical writers, of course, focus on, and this is the introduction of the cult of Baal, the famous Canaanite god of fertility, the god of bring storms that we met before. And here we can see some of these cultic practices that are known from the Phoenician world and are probably related to this fertility cult. We can see here images in clay of women, some of them naked, some of them are pregnant. And again, the feminine organs are all related to the idea of the fertility and the fertility practices. We learned that together with the introduction of the cult of Baal into the northern kingdom of Israel and later on also to Judah, we have also the cult of Ashtoreth, who was the consort of Baal. In one of the figurines here on her belly, we can see also the symbol of another Phoenician goddess known as Tanit. And Tanit is known not only as a fertility goddess within the Phoenician city-states, but also later on in the famous kingdom of Carthage in northern Africa, today Tunisia, which was one of the most important deities in this civilization. Behind me is a very impressive model of Jerusalem in the First Temple period. A few years before it was conquered and destroyed by the Babylonians. We were just talking about the Solomonic Temple, which can be seen right here on top of Mount Moriah, on top of the Temple Mount, in the area that was extended by King Solomon. Jerusalem became the capital of Israel in the time of King David, Solomon's father, who on purpose conquered this place and made it his capital because it was in the middle between his tribe, the tribe of Judah, and the northern tribes, which were part later on of the northern kingdom of Israel. David conquered what is known as the city of David, which can be seen right over here. And later on, Solomon extended the boundaries of the city, building also his own palaces and also the temple. The later areas of the city of Jerusalem were added to the city in the time when Jerusalem was now the capital of the kingdom of Judah after the division of the united monarchy of David and Solomon. We can see that those areas, today part of the Jewish and Armenian quarters in Mount Zion in Jerusalem, were also fortified by a wall that was built probably in the late 8th century in the time of King Hezekiah. Let's see some artifacts that are related to this time period. Follow me. From the time of King Hezekiah, in the late 8th century BCE, we can see those jar handles that all of them bear imprints of famous impressions, seal impressions, that bear in the Paleo-Hebrew script the word Lamelech, which means belonging to the king, together with 4 place names, including Hebron, Ziph, and Socho, all known from the Bible, but also an enigmatic place with the letters Mem, Mem, Shin, and Taf, Mamshit or Mamshat, maybe the name of Jerusalem or some nearby administrative center from that time. It is believed that those jar handles that were part of large vessels that stored both oil and olive oil and wine were part of the tax collection in the kingdom of Judah during the time of Hezekiah and maybe even later under the domination of both the Assyrian and the Babylonian empires. Beside the stamped jar handles, we can see here a group of what we call the Judean pillar figurines. They show representations of women. We can see the perfect hairdress and the very, very visible breast, also probably related to the fertility cult. Those pillar figurines were found all around Judah, both in Jerusalem, in ancient Jerusalem, but also in other sites and cities in Judah. And they probably show us the influence, again, the cultic influence, both of the Canaanite and maybe even the Phoenician religion and practices, which are documented very well in the words, the angry words of the prophets of Israel against these practices, and the fact that the people of Israel abandoned their agreement with the God of Israel and followed foreign goddesses. The fact that we find those fertility figurines that represent probably Canaanite or Phoenician influence within Judah are actually reflecting that the angry words of the prophets of Israel that we find in the God of Israel, that we find in the Bible, actually represent reality and practices that actually existed in Jerusalem and in Judah in the First Temple period before the destruction of the First Temple. Let's go now and see another very interesting inscription that talks about the same period of time. We talked about the influence of the Phoenician alphabet, how it actually got to the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. And here we have one of the most interesting examples here in the museum. This is a graffiti inscription that was found in a funerary tomb somewhere in the Judean hills. And it bears an inscription with two lines. The first line is talking about a curse to a guy whose name is Chagav, which means grasshopper in Hebrew. So cursed be Chagav, son of Chagav. But the next line, the second line, is much more significant to us, because it says, in the name of the God of Israel, the name of the God of Israel, the Lord of hosts, Adonai Tzvaot. And this is the earliest extra-biblical example of this title of the God of Israel that we find in the book of Isaiah and in other places as one of the most important titles of the God of Israel. So here we see the national God of Israel, which we find also in personal names and of course in the biblical writings. And it is interesting to say that when we talk about the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, the two, we can say almost twin kingdoms, have their national God, the same national God, the God of Israel, who appears in these inscriptions. Let's now meet the great empires that actually had a huge effect on the fate of both the kingdom, the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, and the kingdom of Judah. We now entered into the age of empires. We are now in gallery that focuses on the two major empires that had a major impact on the fate of both Israel and Judah in biblical times. The first one, of course, is the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Assyria in northern Mesopotamia became a very dominant superpower starting from the 9th century onwards, but especially from the 8th century and the 7th century BCE. At its peak, it controlled almost the entire Fertile Crescent, from Babylon in the south, Iran in the east, southern Anatolia and northern Syria in the north, and even the Levant and Egypt. One of the most dominant things about the Assyrian was their military mechanism. The Neo-Assyrian army was the most sophisticated and powerful from all the armies at that time, and that enabled the Neo-Assyrian kings to expand their territories and to reach to borders that never been achieved before. Ahead of us we can see two reliefs that are depicting Assyrian soldiers. Here on a basalt slab that probably decorated an Assyrian palace, maybe of a governor in northern Syria, we can see two Assyrian foot soldiers. We can identify them because they have those typical helmets with crescents on their head. We see that they are holding spears and also arrows inside the quivers and their shields. Foot soldiers, as those are depicted in many bas-reliefs that decorated the palaces of the Assyrian kings. Here, one of the most famous one of them, from the palace that Sennacherib built in his capital, his new capital, Nineveh, today in the northern part of modern Iraq. What we can see here is a scene, a battle scene, that is depicting a battle that took place in the mountains of Lebanon, and this was part of the third military campaign of Sennacherib against the Levant, against the West, an episode that is depicted in the book of Kings and the book of Isaiah in the time of Hezekiah, king of Judah, who was one of the three leaders of this revolt in the West that took place after Sennacherib's father, Sargon II, died in battle. Here again we can see an Assyrian foot soldier, again with the crescented helmet. Right here, the nose and the mouth of a horse and the forelegs of a horse, probably an Assyrian cavalryman fighting against two local Sidonite Phoenician soldiers. At the background we can see the mountains of Mount Lebanon. This is one of the most famous examples that we have of the Assyrian depiction of battle scenes and military campaigns. This one is coming specifically from Sennacherib palace without a rival in his royal city Nineveh. This palace is one of the earliest finds that Westerners found from the ancient Near East, and actually opened for us the entire world of what is known today as Assyriology. Okay, the studies of the cultures and the historical records coming from Mesopotamia. Together with this bas-relief, I want to show you another one which actually demonstrates another feature of the imperial mechanism of the royal Assyrian kings. Famous palace of Sennacherib, the palace without a rival in Nineveh, we have another part of another scene from the other side of the empire, this time in the area of Babylon in southern Mesopotamia. We see here a deportation scene. In the middle, a horse, all packed with artifacts that the deportees, meaning the people that the Assyrians conquered, in this case Babylonians, are carrying with them as they go for exile. One of the things that we read in the Bible regarding the Neo-Assyrian Empire is their mass deportation policy, meaning that they, after conquering a territory, they take big parts of the local population and they deport them, settle them in new locations. This was mean both to punish the rebelling population, but also to use the manpower of the conquered lands in order to develop and strengthen the empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Of course, the deportation is one of the most known elements also in the biblical depictions of the faith of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. After conquered by the Assyrians, Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, was devastated, and many of its population much of its population was deported and taken to areas which are in northern Mesopotamia and even in what today is the territory of Iran. The same goes for the faith of the Judeans, people from Jerusalem and other parts of the kingdom of Judah, that in the early 6th century, after the conquest and the destruction of Jerusalem, were taken into Babylon, settled there, and actually started their new life in the new lands that were taken to. So I want to introduce you now to the Babylonians. Please follow me. In front of us we see a magnificent model of Babylon around 600 BCE. One of the greatest capitals, royal cities ever built, the place to which the Judean exiles were sent to already from the year 597 BCE in the time of the king Jehoiachin and his family. Probably Jehoiachin arrived to this, the center of the city, where we can see the two palaces that were built by Nebuchadnezzar, the destroyer of Jerusalem and the first temple, and also the cultic center, and most prominent, the ziggurat, the sacred tower of Babylon, maybe the inspiration of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel that we find in Genesis. The expedition that excavated Babylon something like 120 years ago was a German one, and when they excavated the ruins of the palaces of Nebuchadnezzar, they found also some administrative documents written in cuneiform script that we already saw. A few of those documents mention not other than Jehoiachin, king of Judah, who was deported by the Babylonians in the year 597. He is mentioned together with other people that received rations of oil from the king's table. And this is very interesting, first of all, because we have evidence of the presence of the Judean king, the exiled king in Babylon, but also that it is also related to what we read in the last episode of the second book of Kings about the release of Jehoiachin from the prison following the death of Nebuchadnezzar and the beginning of the reign of his successor, Evil Merodach, Amel Marduk in his Babylonian name. So this extraordinary city, which was huge. I mean, the length of its fortification were 17 kilometers. Here we see only the central part of it, the central neighborhood. So we're talking about really a metropolis, and here the exiles, the Judean exiles, were brought here to Babylon and other parts of Babylonia, the land of Babylon, to start their new careers. And we know that we have evidence that the royal family of Judah was here in Babylon, the capital, but in other places, rural places, we have evidence of other Judean communities that were brought together, and this enabled them to actually maintain their national and religious identity. And when Babylon was conquered by Persia, and the Persian rulers like Cyrus and his successors allowed the Judeans to return to Judah and rebuild the temple, many of them did this and actually started what we call the Second Temple period. So I invite you now to join me and see the glory of ancient Persia and the beginning of the Second Temple period. In front of us, we see this interesting map which depicts the boundaries of the huge Persian Empire. When we talked before about the Neo-Assyrian and the Babylonian empires, the area that they actually controlled was what we call the Fertile Crescent, right here from the Persian Gulf all the way to northern Syria until the Levant, and even sometimes also the northern part of Egypt. But when we talk about the Persian Empire, its boundaries were much larger, and actually this is the largest empire that the world ever saw. Until then, we're talking about the late 6th century BCE until the 4th century, when Alexander the Great, actually from Macedonia, conquered the Persian Empire. So as the book of Esther says, the boundaries of this empire started in the east from India, which is right over here, and reached Nubia or biblical Kush, which is right over here. The Bible doesn't tell us that the other corners of this empire in the east started in what today is Afghanistan, the land of the Scyths, and reached in its peak in the 5th century to even Greece itself, so actually entering into Europe. Within this huge empire, in the 5th satrap, beyond the Euphrates, we find Judea and Jerusalem, the place to which the Judean exiles were allowed to return in their homecoming and build the temple. We have a lot of evidence about the situation in Judea from that time, from the Bible, but also from other artifacts. Some of them are in display here in the museum. For example, the tiny coins that the Persian emperors allowed the local governors to mint, what we call the tiny coins of Yahud. Together with it, we also learn, for example, from the book of Esther, that every year the representatives from all the conquered territories would come to the Persepolis, to the capital of the Persians, and they would actually bring their annual taxes to the empire. This probably is the setting of what we read in the book of Esther about the famous gathering and feast that the Persian emperor held in one of his royal cities. In this case, we talk about Susa, biblical Shushan, the setting of the story of the book of Esther. So with this glory of Persia and what we know about the Persians, we actually end this episode of the introduction and learning about the biblical nations that we're going to meet along this interesting seminar. I hope you enjoy it.